Hi, I'm Joseph. In this video, I want to touch on NativeScript. It's going to be a three-part series of NativeScript versus Flutter, my experiences in both. Just to get a little premise to this, I have been using NativeScript for a while now, um, back when it was really pivoted for business-style applications where you didn't need a whole lot of flashy stuff. You needed this bare bones, basic native experience for business line apps. They have changed their overall aspect of this, and they want this to be more consumer grade. So this is kind of my endeavor into showing some of the weak points of NativeScript. It's not really meant to be like just like a rant video, but point out some of the points of problems you'll run into. And some of these are not unique to NativeScript. You'll run into these on React Native, on Titanium, on Xamarin. It doesn't really matter. Like you're using Xamarin Forms, you're going to be running into these things anyways. So here we go. On the left hand side, I have iOS. On the right hand side of this, I have Android. These are physical devices. This is just an iPhone 6 Plus. This is Samsung S7. Ooh, I need to fix the icons there. So as I talk, I will fix that. So I can interact with my Samsung device through my screen, but for my iOS, I have to physically touch it because it just doesn't have that feature. And I have hot module reloading turned on, so you shouldn't really see kind of like a whole restart of the entire app, just a restart the screen, and it should retain some of the data if I do like CSS tweaks. This way I'm not losing any of the data there. Okay, so this is just a little animation that I've set up for like a login screen. I have the replay button here so I can replay it on both iOS and Android if I need to. But it's a little stutterish on Android because it's going through like a video thing, and so it's just going to be a little bit stutterish anyways. But I just want to start to touch on some of the things that you'll run into at this point. So this wasn't all roses. This wasn't a very simple process. In fact, it was a very frustrating process because of some of the quirks that happen in NativeScript, but then also on these platforms specifically. Okay, first would be just simple styling things. Let's say, let's say on Android, you didn't really change anything. You just start putting some extra styles around stuff. You'll notice that there's an underline on it when you focus on it. The underline gets highlighted. I have an animation playing, so like it expands it out. Should probably add some more padding around that. But let's say you want to get rid of the underline. So the first thing you'd probably do is just say like border bottom width 0, so you don't have, assuming it's a border. And yes, this is CSS. NativeScript supports a limited range of CSS properties. Border is one of them. But as you see, the border doesn't go away. So you can say, okay, well, what if I just set the border color to transparent? And guess what? That doesn't really work either. So you still have to have some type of border sets for this to happen. And to bring this home, this is really just an Android specific issue. There's an Android theme outside of the NativeScript stuff. So NativeScript, I have Core Light theme. Android has its own theming applied to it. It's like a material design type of theme inside of the package. I guess NativeScript sets it up for you, but it's an annoying thing at that because like the buttons, if I go ahead and get rid of this, the buttons have some type of styling attached to it. And let's say like there's a background color, there's a drop shadow. When you click it, it does like the material design ripple effect. And when I apply some basic styling to it, it just gets rid of all the default styling that the button had in the first place. So this is just something that is important to understand for Android, because you may be getting to points where you can't seem to style a specific widget as expected. The other thing has to do with the some of the general CSS limits that this thing supports. Here I have drop shadows here, and drop shadows are not really supported by NativeScript at this point. They want to be able to implement the box shadow spec, but they can't, mainly because Android doesn't really have a good native support for drop shadows, other than the fact it has elevation, which elevation is meant for material design. So as you see here, this is actually using the native elevation controls that Android provides out of the box. iOS does not have an understanding of elevation. It just has shadow radius, shadow offset, shadow color, so it's a lot more flexible than Android. And so I'm using a package called NativeScript Card View, and that gives me access to those native aspects. It doesn't try to make them the same value, so you actually need to guess on what you should be setting. And here, like, there's a little offset at the bottom I haven't set for Android or for iOS, but Android has it set because it's just using the elevation of the default styling for that package. And that has some weird quirks. So, for example, let's say I didn't set a background color for the card view. On Android, it will continue to show a drop shadow, but on iOS, it'll get rid of it completely, which it's not doing. That's weird. It's still synced. I wasn't doing that before. Maybe it was an older version of NativeScript I was working at. The other thing was the font, or so NativeScript supports icons. You can do icons through like text. So you have Font Awesome here. I have it loaded in. It's through a folder called Fonts, and that gets synchronized with the app. And so if I don't put font or color for the icon, it's black on iOS and gray on Android. I'm not quite sure. Maybe it's some default styling Android has, but that's another little quirk I had. The other thing has to do with animations. So for animations, NativeScript supports 5 attributes per se: translation, opacity, rotation, scaling, and oddly enough, background color. Not text color though. So you can animate the background color, you can rotate it, spin it around. They have like origin offsets you can do too. But they don't support like width animation, and if you notice, the inputs kind of grow, so they get wider. So I'm going to show you some of the animation code here. So for the animation of this input, I kind of reset everything because I want a replay value to it. But I'm using another library called Tween. There's a NativeScript package for this because there's some issues with Tween and NativeScript in that it doesn't understand like date, time, or animation frames. So it's like a little package you can set it up so you can just use Tween as you expect it to. And I'm just animating the width per se. So here I get the width from the easing type I'm using and setting offsets and some other stuff. And then for the opacity, I'm just using the default animation. This is a lot more easier than Tween itself. It's a lot more flexible too. It returns like promises, so you can do chaining or wait in the sync. So that's that. This was also a problem for iOS. And this has to do with the iOS constraint system. Certain CSS properties you use will trigger constraints that will really mess up your understanding of what you're trying to do for a layout. And it is a frustrating thing. It's not specific to NativeScript because everything that tries to like generalize layouts also have these little edge cases that cause these issues. And so if you saw, get back one. If you saw like all this commented out code here, I was just trying to like dive into the constraints that we're using and whatever else. None of that stuff was working. I actually jumped into Xcode and did like an explode view on my actual layouts to kind of see all the different type of UI views used and where their positioning was and the constraints. And so I found that if I had padding set on the container that I am animating, it just gives some really weird constraints that are really screwing stuff up. So let me re-enable this. And it's only had to do with like the fact that I'm animating the width. If I did the opacity, the translation, all that stuff worked just fine. It was just this that was the problem. So as I replay it, as you see, like it's all off, whatever reason, and it keeps going off and off and off. And again, this has to do with the fact that when you add, I guess, padding to something that you're also changing the width on due to the constraints that you have set up, it just breaks on iOS. And Android, it works just fine. I mean, it doesn't do anything at all really to it. Okay, the next thing, the events. So this is another pain point specifically on Android. Let me that's not going to get fixed now. And it has to do with hot reloading. The event system for Android is a bit a pain in the ass for inputs. So for these inputs, you have like a little cursor that pops up, and the keyboard shows up, but because the way I'm running this, it doesn't show. And so I have two events, one for unfocus and one on blur. When you lose the focus of the input, it'll play the reverse animation. So it played it off again. The problem is for inputs, you can't lose focus. You can dismiss the keyboard, but you can't lose focus. There's supposed to be a way where you can focus a different view. So let me show you some of the code for that. And it's not that much code, but it was just a lot of trial and error figuring out what to do. You're supposed to be able to call request focus on any view, and then that's supposed to get rid of the input's focus. So you don't have the cursor showing there anymore, and it'll properly trigger the blur events. That was not the case. No matter what view I set up, it could not request focus and get the cursor to go away and the blur event to trigger. I did things like trying to manually trigger the blur event, passing in the dismiss event arguments into that, and it was just a huge mess. So what I eventually did was I set up a text field down below, set a 0 width and height so it's like invisible, and then I just take the same concept of request focus, but I get the view and get the Android properties that I can call on top of it and just request focus to that. So that's there. And because I've called dismiss the soft input, it just doesn't show anything. So literally when I tap outside of this, that's what it's doing. It's going to that next input, requesting focus on it, but not showing the keyboard. This also created a problem because on Android, it'll trigger every event in the stack, and there's certain ways to handle this on Android natively that I didn't want to get into, but also it's a problem with like the way NativeScript is triggering these events. I'm guessing they're trying to do it to make the systems kind of work in unison, but it's also a pain in my butt. So here I track the last focused input so that I can blur it, and then I also have an ignore tap variable. So when I tap or focus an input, I set the ignore tap. This way, if I tap from username and then I tap to password, the dismiss feature that I talked about, like blurring it and selecting the other input, does not get triggered, because the issue is I have an event on the input, I have an event on the outer rim of this. So like if I click the icon triggers the focus of the input. Even though the input's not there to be triggered, I can trigger it by choosing anywhere on this boundary. So that dismiss input or that ignore tap is incredibly important to not trigger this code. This way the next one can be triggered, and then that can play the focus animation while the other one plays the blur animation, because that triggers automatically on Android. But that was also just a pain in the butt to deal with, and having to dive into both iOS and Androids and deal with their specific features of that to disable like a prevent default or stop propagation or stop immediate propagation or returning false, like all the stuff you'd be used to in web development to stop an event from bubbling up and triggering other events. It's just not available for NativeScript at this time, and I don't know what they're going to do about that. But it is something that should be addressed because it is a pain in the butt. They have things to where like you can set like interactivity, so you can say like is user and interaction enabled or is enabled, and this will basically, like if you tapped it, it wouldn't trigger the events behind it. So I mean, technically, I can kind of wreck like a stack view or some stack layout on it, and on a stack layout, say don't make this user inactivable or whatever. And it's just something that is a pain in the butt to deal with, and I hope they fix that. Okay, so I talked about animations, some graphic limitations, the event system in some remote way, a problem with the constraint system for iOS and dealing with some of the CSS properties. The other thing I want to touch on is the image. So you can't scale an image, unfortunately. I'm using a resource image, so if I go to like app, Android, source, main, res, each each of these have like the NASA logo PNGs at different various scale resolutions, and it'll pick the one appropriate for the device that you're working on. But unless you have like the correct size, you kind of need to scale it down. And for doing something like animation, where you're not really quite sure the size of it, what it's going to be, um, you it's a necessity to be able to scale something. So a minor little workaround that you can do is set it to aspect something. There's like aspect fix. Let me show you all the ones. Fit, fill, and fill by itself. But you would set the width to the container, and then it would fill to that container, and then that sets the width. Because if I go ahead and get rid of this and save it, it'll go ahead and fill to that. But if I just say none, and then I set the width to like 120, yeah, it doesn't do it. It like clips it. That's it. So that's why I would have like the fill thing, and this is like normal per se when I've done like XAML markup or Windows development for stuff. Like you usually have a container to control the width. Android is a similar way too, where you want to control the width of something, but you don't really know what to set it to for the inner object. You set the outer container for that. But that's that. And I think like the biggest thing I've always been bitten by is if you don't have this kind of setup where you can see both Android and iOS at the same time, what you do is you'll very quickly go through like the Android version, making it look very good on that. And then you go look on iOS and there's all these problems, and you got to like go through one by one, start removing some of the code to figure out, okay, what am I doing? Let's isolate it to this. And unless you have a setup to where like I have, where I can literally see both of them on the screen at the same time, um, it's just it's a pain in the butt. And the thing I miss about maybe like in some other frameworks where they have like a GUI, you can literally like drag and drop widgets around and get some general idea before you start to build it. Is that that building experience is stateless. And so I've been in positions to where I literally make a completely separate app from what I have, and it's all stateless. It has all the data that's needed for like rendering a list view, whatever else, all pre-populated into like JSON so that it gets parsed in, and this way I can just like quickly change a few things, see if it works or not, and change a few things, see if it works or not, then copy like the view code into the final app. It's not the best idea. I hope they do something, because they have Sidekick as a way to provide like a good developer experience, but Sidekick doesn't have kind of a GUI builder at this time. But yeah, that's it. So this is going to probably be like a 3-part series. This first one is just me kind of, even though it's a rant, it's really just some gotchas that you're going to be running to with NativeScript. The other one that I'm be focusing on is Flutter. I'm providing like the different experiences for that. I'm not going to go into like React Native or Xamarin or Titanium or the Alloy variant of that, simply because they're all relatively the same. When you're working with native UI, there's a lot of gotchas that you run into. Whereas with Flutter, it's kind of like a clean slate. You're only working with its controlled widgets that it has, and the NativeScript provides a lot of stuff that's outside of like GUI specific things that Flutter just cannot do. And so it'll be interesting to showcase like the differences between them and so on and so forth. Where else, like for example, like on iOS, um, when you have like the keyboard up, the keyboard is its own UI view. It's a sheet that overlays your existing view. So you if this was not a scroll view, you wouldn't be able to scroll. So normally you set like a scroll view, and then you move the scroll views like height from being 100% to be like from the top tier to the bottom of the keyboard. So then you got to do like a calculation of the keyboard's height based off the theme of the keyboard that you have, the key height or whatever else. And there's a good library that already does all this stuff for you. It even has like previous and next buttons here that you can enable and have like little hints and stuff like that next to the stuff. It's really robust, and NativeScript is like a drop-in thing. You just say like TNS plugin add, and then like the keyboard Objective-C library there. But yeah, that's that. I hope this was useful, and maybe you'll be interested in NativeScript. I definitely enjoyed it. I've been using it for basically well over a year now, and had my fun with that. So till then, see ya.